Since I still appreciate you, let's find love while we may. Because I know I'll hate you when you are old and gray. So say you love me here and now, I'll make the most of that. Say you love and trust me, for I know you'll disgust me when you're old.
And on that note, welcome to Divorcing Your Mortgage. I'm your host, Mark Gertz, where we discuss everything having to do with mortgage, love, and money. That lead-in music was the great Tom Lehrer. If you're not familiar with his work, I highly recommend you look him up, Lehrer. He is a gentleman who is now retired up in Santa Barbara, California, was way ahead of his time when he wrote those songs back in, believe it or not, the 1950s. I wanted to open up our show today with the aftermath of divorce. Most people don't really spend a lot of time talking about that period. We get so hung up in talking about prenups and postnups and the lead up to a divorce and going through the divorce. We don't talk about the final steps that we need to take once the divorce is done, once it's finished. I mean, completely finished. Everything's signed, and all of a sudden you're in your own space, and there's nobody there but you. Now what do you do? Okay, now what do you do? So one of the things that people tend to forget to do, particularly in couples where there was an uneven distribution of control over income, is they forget to establish separate accounts. Many spouses, whether they're male or female, got in the habit of doing things jointly. And now that the dust has settled, they really need to start to establish themselves. You know, I say it in terms of establishing separate accounts, but many times it's a question of establishing even more basic things like, what colors do you like? What color do you want the drapes to be? Do you want drapes? Do you want drapes? But sticking with money for a moment, establishing separate accounts. You want to close inactive joint bank accounts and investment accounts. You want to review any of these, and you want to start establishing your own financial signature. You need to start putting things in your own name, not just savings accounts or retirement or investing accounts, but things like credit cards too. It's not uncommon for couples to have credit cards in both names and nothing individually. So one of the first things that you need to do is to start sort of acting as if you're starting from scratch all over again. And you need to get help on these things. Many times a good banker is somebody that can be a good sounding board for what you need to put together. What are some of the basic things that you're going to need? Another way to do it is you might consider making a list of your individual property and at the same time making a list of your debts. It's a good time. It's a good time now that the acrimony is over, and the paperwork is over and the divorce is over, to take stock, to really take stock and figure out what it is that you need and how you're going to establish that. You know, one other aspect of establishing accounts is, especially for women, in what name? What name do you want to be known by moving forward? Are you going to keep your previously married name, or are you going to go back to your maiden name? These are all very important considerations. uh, in terms of establishing your own finance moving forward. And they have repercussions down the road. So these are actually decisions that need to be made in sort of what I would call a sober environment, by which I mean take stock, sit in the silence, get some advice, and figure out basically who you're going to become moving forward. Um, Another thing that you want to look into is determining what your post-divorce income is going to be. Just like you need to take stock of your accounts, you need to now reassess what your income is and how you're going to allocate it. Where is your income going to come from after the divorce? When we come back after this message, we're going to continue on post-divorce income. I'm your host, Mark Gertz. This is Divorcing Your Mortgage. And we're back on Divorcing Your Mortgage. I'm your host, Mark Gertz. We're talking about all things divorce, love, and money. Just before the break, we were talking about things that you need to start looking at after the divorce is over, after the dust has settled. And we were talking about determining your post-divorce income. Now, you may think that during the divorce is when you did that, but not wholly. I mean, you need to figure out what it is you want to do. Most of the time, couples are on reduced incomes after a divorce. They've divided those assets. They've also incurred more expenses, especially if you're not living together. You've got double the overhead, and that can be a little bit of a shock. In addition to that, if you've gone through a divorce in the last year or two, you know that the cost of living has significantly increased, and maybe when you were negotiating your divorce terms, you didn't take this into consideration. So you need to look at where your income is going to come from after a divorce. If you weren't working during the marriage, are you going to receive alimony or child support? You probably know that by now. But you also need to know what these amounts are going to look like and how long you're going to receive them for. I have a client that I'm working with right now. They were divorced in 2018, and the wife, in this case, in this particular marriage, is receiving alimony, but she only has 2 more years of alimony to receive, and she needs to make plans on what's going to happen in 24 months and how she's going to maintain the house that she wants to keep, how she's going to keep making the payments on that, and if not, what alternatives are going to be there to do that. So you need to look at these things. You need to look at whether or not you really want to get a job. It's not uncommon after a marriage of 10 or 20 or 25 years that one spouse maybe wasn't working that much and they don't have that much current job history that they can use to do the things they want to do. Maybe right now, before your expenses go up, is need to figure out what would you like to do working wise for the next 10 or 20 years. Maybe the things that you did before you were married or during your marriage are not really things that you love. They were things that you did out of accommodation. Now you're single. Now there's nobody to accommodate except you. And guess what? If you're in your 40s or your 50s or your 60s, it doesn't mean you can't learn new skills. All right. Old dogs can learn new tricks. How does your post-divorce budget match up to your post-divorce income? You need to sit down and really look at these things and take stock of your situation. If you're the one that's making alimony or child support payments, you also have another set of questions to ask. How will this impact your monthly take-home income? What's the payment schedule going to look like? How are you going to structure that? How does your post-divorce budget match up to your post-divorce income? These are these are really important things to sit down and look at. You don't want to hit the ground running. You want to hit the ground standing still. You need to set a new household budget. That's number 3 on this list. You have a new household. Maybe you're still living in the house that you were in before you got divorced. You still have a new household budget. It's only you. Maybe you have a roommate. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're renting out rooms. You have to look at what these expenses are going to be. If you weren't handling the household expenses before the divorce, now you have to become familiar with those, all right, and figure out how to handle these things correctly. Keeping track of money can be hard during the best of times, and it's likely to be even harder in the stress-filled days after a divorce. By taking charge of your household budget, you may be able to avoid incurring additional debt, because the last thing you want to start incurring is high interest debt now that you're out of the divorce. If you didn't enjoy being married or shackled to another person, trust me, you're not going to enjoy being shackled to credit cards. Another area you need to look at is starting your own retirement plan. Maybe you were the spouse that was home. You didn't have a retirement plan. Yes, it may be a little bit later than what most people would do, but you still have the ability to put something together. All right. If you've been relying solely on your spouse's retirement plans, you need to establish one for yourself. A financial professional will have many options for you. And I can't stress enough that nobody makes it out here alone, especially for those of you that are older. If you're sort of mesmerized by the internet and overwhelmed by all the information, guess what? That isn't the only place to get information. Get a referral, talk to a friend, talk to a trusted advisor or a relative. Start interviewing advisors. You need someone to help you on this journey, not because you're coming out of a divorce, but because you're just simply a human being, and you can't be expected to know everything. I don't know why it is that for some reason, many of us believe that we're supposed to know everything, that we're supposed to have all of the answers and be able to do everything ourselves. That is just not true. Smart people get help from other smart people. I'm Mark Gertz. You're listening to Reverse Your Thinking and Divorcing Your Mortgage. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. You're listening to Divorcing Your Mortgage. I'm your host, Mark Gertz, the show where we discuss everything having to do with divorce, love, and money. My guest this week is Heather Patrick. Heather focuses on complex property divisions, spousal and child support, complex child custody, including move-away orders, paternity issues, premarital and postmarital agreements, post-divorce and support modifications, as well as dissolution of domestic partnerships and same-sex marriages. After spending a considerable amount of time in a Southern California family law firm, she's been able to use that experience to start her own firm. And what she specializes in is big firm experience with boutique firm care. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for having me.
Happy to have you. Really happy to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
So I was wondering if before we get into all things divorce, maybe you could just share with us a little bit how it was that you came to get into family law. What was it? Was it a straight line right out of law school, or What eventually attracted you?
So that's a great question. I was in my last year of college and I was taking the GREs and the LSATs because I didn't know if I wanted to be a therapist or if I wanted to go to law school. And then I realized that if I was going to spend this much money on an education, I should know. So I took 3 years off and figured things out, did a lot of volunteer work before and realized my skill set was more in line with advocacy more
Uh-huh.
than it was what you would think of as a therapist. So yeah, I was a late bloomer, I guess. I didn't go to law school right out of undergrad, and that
Oh,
has, I think, helped me quite a bit because I've been very intent on my goals since then.
that's great. That's great. So do you get a lot, do you get involved in a lot of collaborative situations, or are they more contentious?
So I think the collaborative law process is to be applauded. But that being said, I am not a part of that process, and
Okay.
my skill set, I guess, like I had said earlier, is more for when it gets pretty contentious. Although I love being able to settle a case, and I think I'm really good at it. Unfortunately, there just are those cases
There
where
are.
it just has to get to court,
Right.
and that's usually where I come in.
Do you, in terms of couples like that aren't able to come to an agreement and settle things collaboratively, do most of those cases go to court, or are you able to sort of settle out of court?
I would say that most of them you're able to settle out of the court.
Hmm.
I think the last time I heard this statistic, it was something, most Californians actually get divorced without a lawyer. Um, and
Really?
that really tells you that people are really just getting divorced and they're kind of moving on with their lives and doing their best that they can. And
Okay.
then it also has something to do with finances as well.
Sure.
But attendant to that is this idea that we have these lawyers, but 9 out of 10 of my cases are going to be resolved between me and opposing counsel,
Uh-huh.
or me opposing counsel and a mediator. And it's rare that you have to end up going to court, but when you end up going to court, you're usually going to be there for a bit of time.
Got it. Okay. Well, family law is a pretty broad name for the type of law that you specialize in. It includes a lot of different things, um, prenups, postnups, and on and on and on. Um, is do you do a lot in the area of prenuptial agreements?
I do. I do.
Yeah,
I think that you're right. There is a lot under the broad spectrum
the
of
umbrella.
family.
Yeah.
Yeah, umbrella. Good. But I would 10 to 15% of my practice is prenups, whereas
Okay.
most family law lawyers I know don't even touch them. Or there's the
Hmm.
prenup lawyers who almost, 90% of their work is that.
Really?
Right. But when I was at a Century City firm for an
Hmm.
extended period of time,
Right.
one partner did only prenups, and I worked with her quite a bit. So you end up learning, I ended up learning it from there, but I appreciate it because it really balances out the rest of the litigiousness of my caseload. So
I see. Okay. See, and that's interesting because that's almost a niche within a niche,
it is.
do-
Yes, true.
doing that. I've never heard anybody say, can you refer me to a prenup lawyer? But I guess there is. I guess there is.
There definitely
Okay.
are. The laws in California especially have changed
Yeah. And
so much over the last few years in prenups that you
mhm.
need somebody who's on top of the law.
And for those of you that are listening that are not in California, just want to let you know that when Heather's talking about Century City, this is an area uh, of Los Angeles that is, for lack of a better term, chock-a-block with attorneys. It's
That's right. Hey, there's some bankers in there too.
and there's a few bankers, right? There's a few bankers. That's right. But having a Century City attorney actually, still means something.
Mhm.
And Heather is a or
Thanks.
was a Century City attorney
Yeah.
before she opened up her own practice. Is there anything in, speaking about prenups for a second, staying on that subject, is there anything in prenuptials that, I don't know, that's particularly unique? I mean, are there any provisions that people look for when they talk with you about these things?
Well, I think something I'm still shocked by that keeps that I'm asked frequently
Mhm.
when I have my prenuptial clients, premarital agreement clients, is the adultery clause, is whether or not, can we
Really?
put something in there that if she or he would has an infidelity, that all bets are off. And the answer, my friends, is no. That is against public policy. I don't believe there is a jurisdiction in the United States that would allow for that at all. But I have to say, I'm quite surprised how frequently that I get asked that question when I'm dealing with prenups.
I see.
Something that people really are thinking about. A second to that would be spousal support, or alimony is a different term for that.
Uh-huh.
And people want to know, if we get divorced in 5 years, am I going to have to pay he or she X amount of money? And they want to sign off of that entirely, saying that no matter what, I'll never have to pay you spousal support. That you can waive out of.
Wow.
There are some very detailed steps and certain things you have to do in order to waive spousal support or alimony.
Right.
Which one of them includes is that each party must be represented by their own attorney. Otherwise, it would not be valid or enforceable. And there's some timing of things as well, such as you have to make sure that you receive that first draft of the premarital agreement, X amount of weeks before the wedding date, and you have to have at least 7 days to review it.
Wow.
And then it has to also be 7 days prior to the date of marriage. So you've really got some timing in there. So for any of your listeners who are thinking about premarital agreements, timing is of the essence. The earlier you can do it, the better.
Uh-huh.
Because there are a lot of time iterations in there that the parties have to in order to comply. Or, for instance, somebody called me 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
and their wedding date is in June, and I would have loved to have helped them, but I won't do that because the timing is such that I didn't know if I could whiz a prenup out, get all
Right.
those negotiations done, and have those blocks of time left so that they would have a valid enforceable order. And
I
even
see.
if you did, on my side of things, if things go bad down the road, I don't want that potential exposure on my side of
Have
things.
you ever had a situation where people wanted to do a prenuptial agreement before he proposed?
Oh, they do that a lot, actually.
Really?
Well, okay, so I will say there's definitely a generational issue here.
Tell us.
So my clients who are in their 40s and their 50s, who are in their second or third marriages, they are ready to talk about the premarital agreement on the third date.
Mhm. Oh,
Right. And so they'll call
okay.
me. But the younger generation, they're still romantic about things. And so I've never received a client that's done that before the marriage, before the
Okay.
proposal.
Before the engagement?
Mhm.
I figured maybe the guy would want to do it before he spends the money on the ring,
Well, if they don't get married, Mark, then he gets the ring back.
And he gets the ring back. There you
Yeah.
go.
So there you go.
So when you say that clients have wanted to put an adultery clause in a prenup, you mean, in other words, that if the other spouse committed adultery, that the prenup would be void? Is that what they want?
Right, basically,
I
and
see.
I am going to use some stereotypical
Sure.
genders here because that is the only way I've experienced it personally.
Okay.
But
That's all
it's a male client usually saying, I'm going to, in the event of a divorce, there's all of this money that's going to be her way, or this property is going to go her way, or, be
Right.
transferred to her, but not if she cheats.
Oh,
Right. So then you would want it to be undone. So It's not, and that's even true for California divorces,
Uh-huh.
it's a no-fault state, meaning that any kind of adultery or cheating, whether or not there's a premarital agreement or a postnuptial agreement, it's
Mhm.
never gonna be relevant to the proceedings in a divorce.
And do you find that the people that ask about that are younger couples more than older?
Older,
Older. Oh, that's interesting.
older,
Okay. All right.
older because I think, they've been hurt before,
Yeah, I get
you
it.
know?
Yeah. And the reason I was asking about is because I I wasn't conscious in younger couples that fidelity was that big a deal anymore.
Mm,
Okay.
mm,
But apparently it is, huh?
it is, yes,
Yes. Very interesting.
yes.
Very interesting. Okay. All
Based
right.
on my little slice of experience here, yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Um, does do you find it, how would I put this? Is there one or two things in particular that dissolve marriages that make them contentious? Are there flashpoints you
Oh, well,
find?
it's absolutely adultery.
Adultery is, would you say
Number
that's number
one,
one?
right?
Yeah.
If you can, there's a saying that maybe you've heard of, but
Mm.
in family law courts, you find very good people on their worst behavior. In criminal courts, you find very bad people on their best behavior.
I've never heard that, but that's great. I like that.
So
Yeah,
it's very true, and
very true.
it's unfortunate. These are typically good people.
Hmm.
Your uncle, my aunt, everybody's involved in this, and it just brings out the worst in people sometimes. So number one, I would say, is cheating, adultery. Number two is substance abuse, and
Substance
not
abuse.
not
Okay.
because the person without the substance abuse problem is being vindictive, but usually there are children involved, and then that makes the parent who does not have the substance abuse issue be extremely defensive,
Protective.
and
Yeah.
protective.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure.
So I would say those are the two major things. But
That- and that's
when I go into adultery, I should say sometimes it's money adultery. Sometimes
money
it's,
adultery. Yeah.
yeah, sometimes
Yeah,
it's
I was going to ask you about that because I've always felt that money was a big flashpoint in in marriages or the dissolution of them, right?
Mhm. But it
But I would
comes out
imagine
in the, the spending the money on the mistress or the
on the mission,
mister,
the mistress
or
in
the substance
particular,
abuse or the substance.
same thing.
It comes out that way too.
Gotcha. I
Mhm.
understand. Okay. Um, let's switch gears for a moment. Let's talk about common law marriage. All right, which is interesting in the state of California because and a lot of people don't know this, that California doesn't recognize common law marriage. But maybe you could explain to us the difference between in California between common law marriage and what's it called, palimony. It's
Yes.
like because California does recognize palimony.
Yes, that's
So
correct.
can you explain to us what the difference is there?
So it's been a while since I looked up common law marriage in other jurisdictions, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but
No, just California.
my understanding is that in other jurisdictions, if you live together, usually for 10 years, if I recall correctly, then you are common law married, and any of the rights and responsibilities that go into being married, then
Right.
you would have those, such
Hmm.
as, death benefits, such as, those sorts of things. Whereas in
Uh-huh.
California, you would never have those rights
Right.
without you A, being married, or B, finding some other contractual way to create those rights.
Hmm.
But that being said, there's this case from the 70s. Marvin is the name of the case. And
Right.
he was a baseball player.
Hmm.
And he had he was a famous baseball player, and he had a girlfriend for an extended period of time. I think maybe even over 10 years. And they lived together for an extended period of time, and he promised her, oh, you're never going to have to work, you don't have to do this, and yes, we're going to go buy that house over here, and we're going to make all of this money, we're going to make this life together. Well, I think he got a new girlfriend, broke up with her, and she said, excuse me, you promised me all of these things. So in the state of California, you can have a cause of action for an oral breach of contract, and that's essentially where palimony came from.
I see.
Is this one case, Marvin. And so she took him to court and went to the Court of Appeal and went to the Superior Court of California. And that case gave us the basic rules, the tenets and the rules for palimony, which says that if you do tell somebody that you're cohabitating with, you know, these promises, and she relies thereupon, or he or she, then there's going to be a cause of action and you will have to do that.
Okay, so palimony really doesn't have as much to do with common law marriage. It has to do with contracts.
And it's cohabitation,
Right.
and an oral contract
Gotcha.
is really where that would come from. But they are interesting cases. They are
Okay.
interesting cases.
Yes, that is very interesting cases. Okay, well, so we're going to take a break in a few minutes, and when we come back, Heather, let's talk about some of your cases. Is that okay? Can we do
Sounds
that?
great.
All right, let's do that. You're listening to Divorcing Your Mortgage, where we discuss everything having to do with divorce, mortgages, finance, and love. We'll be back after this break. Stay with us. And we're back on Divorcing Your Mortgage. I'm your host, Mark Gertz, and our guest this week is attorney Heather Patrick. Heather, in my introduction of you, one of the things that I noticed was that you said that you do same-sex marriages, right? Is there anything in
Or
particular?
separations.
What's
Not
that?
the marriages. I don't do the marriages. I do the separations.
The separations. Okay, right. That. Thank you. Right. Same-sex divorces. Right. All right. Good point. Is there any difference ultimately? I mean, are there any things that are unique to the dissolution of a same-sex marriage as opposed to a heterosexual marriage?
I would say that the main answer is no, but but there are personal differences, and I do think, at least in my experience, there are usually a need for more confidentiality sometimes, which you can't get through the courts. And like any case, you know, we're in California. You know, there's many different kinds of people, many different cultures, and you know, I have many cases with clients who are from Iran or consider themselves Persian. And, you know, that's an entirely different space and rules and cultural rules to follow. So, you know, I think that when I'm dealing with my clients who are in same-sex marriages, then there's certain things that they prefer for my skill set, or the way in which I would handle a case. But as far as what the law is, how it's going to move through the case and through the courts, there's not going to, or, you know, how property is going to be divided, whether or not support's going to be awarded, it's all the same.
It's pretty much the same. Are you at liberty to give us an example of
Sure. Of specifically that?
Yeah, specifically that.
Yeah, so right now I have one client who was in a same-sex marriage. They have one child, the child's 7, and much like any of my other cases that would be with heterosexual couples, they're going through a process to dissolve their marriage. And in the same way that in a heterosexual marriage, they are going to have to divide their property that they acquired, the money that they acquired. They're going to have to come up with a custodial plan for their child, and all the same factors that would be relevant in any other marriage are going to be relevant here. You know, so for instance, in this case, one of the people, they're lesbians in this case, and so one lady worked the entire time and the other one did not. So the person who has been working
Mhm.
is going to end up being a payor of spousal support or of alimony, while this other woman has enough time to kind of get back on her feet
Mhm.
and start working and getting back into the swing of things, so to speak.
Right.
And they're going to split custody 50-50. They're very amicable, which
Is
is always nice to see.
is
She
are
is,
there
or
are
they
there any
are.
differences? Are there any differences in same-sex divorces in the sense that one party is, I would imagine in many cases, one party is biologically a parent and the other isn't? Does that change anything?
That's so strange. That's so funny you say that because I just met somebody, not going, somewhat different, but yes, that does happen. But that being said, there's usually paperwork that's
Uh-huh.
been around long before I was involved about how they're both the parents. And I think that that does impact the case at times,
Mhm.
or I could see the potential, but I haven't seen a case where that's happened.
Okay.
What I was going to say is what I find interesting is I have a kind of a colleague who they had twins, but it was two the same donor egg, but two different sperms. So then they each had one of the
Oh,
males, and so that ended up working out really well. So it could have been equal in that case.
interesting. Okay.
Very interesting.
Um, one of the things that people always are shocked about when they start a divorce, especially the first time, is how long it takes. Okay. Um, is there a reason for that?
There is, and when I get any new client, that's one of the first things I share with them because it's just unbelievably disappointing and it elongates people's suffering. It
Mhm.
also makes people change their mind if they'd had a good idea to resolve things rather quickly, and then more
Mhm.
time goes on before the court can rubber stamp, any sort of agreements. It's a problem. It's a real problem. It was bad before COVID. It was worse during it. We're starting to get back. But the answer is just simple supply and demand.
Mhm.
That's the
Mhm.
problem. It's just there aren't enough judges and there aren't enough courtrooms to have more judges to feed the amount of people going through this process.
So you're saying, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that that a huge factor is not the divorce process. It's just the backlog in the courts.
That's right.
Oh, that's a shame.
If I had well, I did this week. I filed a motion on behalf of one of my clients for custody and for attorney's fees. And I did that for a temporary order. So this is right when the divorce is beginning, and just to get some basic orders set up
Mhm.
on those sorts of things. And I got it returned, and my court date is like July 23rd.
Wow.
And that's just typical right now to get and I'm talking about these are the basic, we need the first orders from the judge, we need
Right.
basic stuff. And when it impacts the children, it's really terrible. So this kid is, going in between parents' homes, both parents probably not really happy without a court order, but
Mhm.
without their agreement, this is how long it's going to take.
Wow. Okay. Um, is there anything different in divorce now? You've been doing it for a while. Okay.
Yes, yes.
So you know what divorce was like before social media was
Mhm,
huge. Okay.
mhm.
Is there any difference now that social media is so rampant compared to how it was maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago?
It's more fun for the lawyers.
It's more fun for the lawyers.
Yes.
Okay.
So
How
you know
so?
what, look, it really is though. And there's this thing called the evidence code that is never taught very well on Law and Order or any other show. And,
Okay.
it really excludes the true evidence code, a lot of evidence that people would like to bring to court. Um, that being said, when you get things done on social media, it's usually a party admission, meaning that it will be admissible in court. So I've seen
Okay.
it help me in my custody cases. I've seen it help me in my support cases, and if in my property cases.
Mm-hmm.
I had a case a few years, this is a few years ago now, where I represented the wife, and the husband was a multimillionaire, and he claimed poverty ever since the date of separation, basically. But being a little bit of a sleuth myself, you can go and find out who his friends are on Facebook, and you figure all this stuff out. And then guess what? The boat that we thought was missing, that was, $1 million boat, he's been on it multiple times since the date of separation. So you get to find them in their lives, and it can be pretty entertaining. And when you're talking about custody, when you see them out and about at certain times of night,
Mm-hmm.
it starts to really help the judge understand that maybe this parent is lying about how often they're home with the child. So
Gotcha.
it's extremely helpful.
Gotcha. Heather, if someone wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way?
My phone number, 310-382-4138.
Say it again.
310-382-4138.
You've been listening to Heather Patrick tell you about the ins and outs of divorce. I'm Mark Gertz. We'll be right back after this. And we're back on Divorcing Your Mortgage. I'm your host, Mark Gertz, and we're still speaking to Heather Patrick, family law attorney. Heather's agreed to stay on with us because we're just having so much fun this afternoon.
It's a good Friday.
Tell us more about social media, Heather.
Well, like I said, these pictures, what is that saying? A picture's worth
Worth
1,000
words, right?
Yeah, that's what it is. And so I shared a little bit about the property, the custody, and the support as well. So, these people, everybody who wants a support order comes into court, especially if they do come from money. They like to come into court appearing as if they do not have any money.
Yes.
But then you can show perhaps that
Through conversations.
15-carat diamond rings that were not on this hand in marriage, or I'm sorry, in court, was worn 4 days after or 4 days before.
Do people? I can understand how social media could definitely come into play before the divorces started, but you're saying that people keep going, thinking that
bonkers
that
Still
no
blows
one's
my
going to
mind.
see it, that it's in a room by itself. Really?
Blows my mind.
Really?
Blows my mind. I wouldn't say everybody. I mean, I would say 50%
lot.
of people are smart enough to
Yeah.
figure it out that they need to not be posting things on social media because they're going through a divorce.
I mean,
But it's shocking
yeah.
to me that 50% of the people don't understand that.
And that's so interesting. And one of the things that I've commented on previous shows is I've talked about the Tom Brady divorce, okay, from Giselle. And what I've talked about it was the fact that these are fabulously wealthy people that are incredibly high profile. And yet the divorce was one of the most low profile splits. You heard nothing about it. I mean, absolutely nothing. Which is, I don't think that's common, is it?
So in my experience, what that tells me is that it's two people who cared for each other, that cared for their children before anybody else.
Oh, okay.
That's what that tells me. And based on my experience, because
Good insight.
Otherwise, when it's really truly just about how angry one person is and having to defend against that, or how angry both people are and having to deal with that, people lose sight of maybe what's ultimately important.
Well, I think divorce brings out the narcissism in people.
So I have a theory.
Yes.
So I have a theory.
Share.
that, unfortunately, there are some people look, there's a lot of people that are married that are happy, and there are a lot of people who are married who maybe aren't so happy. And then there are those who get divorced. And then they kind of move on and they don't need lawyers. And then there's a subset of people who get divorced and need lawyers. And I don't want any of my new potential clients who may be hearing this, but I think my secret is that on these divorces where they really get to court and they have to go there, there's one or both of the people have some sort of narcissistic tendencies, but maybe it's more of what you're saying is it just brings it out in people, because I do see it.
Mm,
That you just can't focus on anything but yourself and this spite and this hate for
mhm,
the other person.
yeah.
And even when you're dealing with lawyers like myself who really do try to make things happen amicably for the parties, and
Mhm,
I'm happy and fortunate enough to say that I'm in a place in my career I don't have to represent the people who are using their children and
mhm,
weaponizing their children or using them as pawns. I just don't. I fire those clients.
mhm.
I don't deal with that anymore. So, but when that happens, it's sad to see. It's
I,
sad to see.
I have no doubt. On that note, what what happens when all of a sudden into this mix that we're talking about, you throw international laws? Okay. I mean,
Yes.
how does that impact? How does that impact all of the other things that we've been talking about?
So that, are you familiar with the Hague Convention? Even if you are, maybe your audience isn't. So the Hague Convention is an international treaty eventually that basic what it does is it says that I will support your laws and you will support mine. And it's
Hmm.
really intended to make sure that there's not international kidnapping. But that being said, you can also use it to make sure that other countries honor your custodial orders.
Uh-huh.
And the issue there, of course, is that not every country is part of it. And again, being in LA, where we have so many people from so many different
So
cultures.
international, sure.
So, I mean, I've had some real problems with my clients when the children are Chinese, Iranian, Vietnamese, or Thai, because those countries are not in the Hague,
Part of the Hague.
aren't part of the Hague. And so, to
Hague
the
Convention.
extent that somebody gets on a plane and takes the child, then you're in a lot of water. Thank God that's never happened to any of my clients.
Ah.
But what does happen there is, let's say all of the money got moved to China, all the money got moved to Iran. I can't get that money back.
Exactly.
I can't get that money back. And, so it's very important, if I could say anything, when you're dealing with those international, either
Mhm.
custody or property issues, and you anticipate getting married, is to meet a lawyer long before you bring up the idea of divorce, so that you can secure your money and your children here
Mhm.
before it is extended anywhere. I think that's
I, I,
a
I
good
would imagine,
idea.
I would imagine in many of those relationships, it's also the woman, um,
Yes,
as
yes.
as
In my
opposed to the
experience,
man.
it has been, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
My name is Mark Gertz. I'm your host. You've been listening to Divorcing Your Mortgage. Our guest has been family law attorney Heather Patrick. Heather, tell us one more time, how do we get in touch with you?
The best way is my phone number. I'm old school, 310-382-4138.
Thank you so much for being with us. You've been terrific.
Thank you.
I'm sure our audience's ears are ringing while they're sitting in traffic waiting to get home. Thank you for joining us. We will see you again next week. For those of you that are on your way home, have a wonderful weekend. Stay dry, and we'll see you again next week on Divorcing Your Mortgage.
I'll never love you then at all the way I do today. So please remember, when I leave in December, I told you so in May.